Okay, so I'm going to talk about the connection between HMP and your XR mind, and you'll soon understand what is your XR mind, which is basically trying to explain or to claim that XR technologies, AR, VR, MR, which I'll introduce in a minute, are actually going to have a huge impact on how our brain works, how we process cognitively the space surrounding us, our body, and how all this relates to our cognitive performance and cognitive enhancement that was mentioned before. So I'll start, in order to make sure we're all on the same page, just a short introduction to AR, MR, VR, which are commonly called XR. So we talk about immersive technologies such as augmented reality that we see with smart glasses, monocular display, kind of a two-dimensional flat overlay of virtual objects on top of the world, either through smart glasses or mobile phones and tablets. Mixed reality is kind of the next generation and what we see as the future of computing platforms, soon to replace all the tablets and phones and laptops, in which you have transparent glasses with stereoscopic displays that kind of mix virtual objects into your physical world, and eventually can actually hide objects in the world or add objects in the world or change the way that you perceive, for instance, your friends and family and all the stuff around you. So this is very radical. But in fact, the third category of virtual reality is more radical in terms of how we cognitively process the world, and you'll understand it in a minute, because in this technology, you wear an opaque pair of glasses which hide the physical world altogether from your vision and kind of surround you with a new world, a new body. And again, we'll discuss how this influences the brain processes that are in charge of processing all this information. So we call these three technologies commonly XR. And because I'm also a bit scared of Cecilia, and I'm not sure, I'm not going to run out of time, so we'll start from the end, from the take-home messages, and then I'll be much more calm here. So we're going to claim that XR is in fact disrupting our body and world perception altogether, okay? Not only by kind of presenting those pixels and surrounding us with a different world, but in a more kind of deep way of perceiving the world. We're going to also claim that cognition, perception, and action are tightly coupled, that all these are working together, and so when we change dramatically the way we perceive the world and the way and the kind of affordances that we have in the world, eventually we change human cognition, which is going to be perhaps the most dramatic disruption, the way I see it, in education of the future, in changing the way we actually think and solve problems and all the cognitive processes that we use in the world. And we will discuss also some implications to human-machine pedagogy later on, but now we can kind of roll back, and as I said, now I'm much more calm, and we can return to the beginning. And one of the fundamentals, in order to understand why XR is going to so fundamentally change the way we perceive the world, is to introduce this paradigm in neuroscience, kind of dominating current neuroscience. Brain researchers now see the brain as kind of a Bayesian brain, or if you like, a probabilistic inference mechanism, meaning that when we experience the world through our senses, what we see or what we experience is not directly or not precisely the world that we experience. In fact, we have some kind of prior belief about the world in different areas of the brain. It's not something that is necessarily conscious. It's kind of internal models of the brain about what we expect to see next when we get these sensory inputs. And what we eventually experience as the world is kind of an integration between the sense world and our prior belief. That's the perceived world, kind of a probabilistic integration. The most likely world, if you like, in terms of probability, the most likely world to generate these sensory inputs. And then this perceived world and this inference goes back and kind of updates our prior belief about the world. And then it goes on, and when we experience the world again and different sensory inputs, then again an integration between our belief about the world, how the world behaves, and these sensory inputs gets us to perceive the world in a different, in some a specific way. interesting point here is that what this means when we talk about XR, VR, AR, MR, is that the impact or the effect of perceiving specific worlds through virtual reality, for instance, the impact of that is not only when you are wearing the glasses, okay? It is kind of injecting some inputs that eventually change your prior belief about how the world should behave. And then you take off these glasses and you experience the world very differently. And I'll show some, this is very abstract and high level. I'll show some specific examples now. So what I'm going to claim is that in the visual sense, but not only in the visual sense, just as an example, we do not see just with our eyes. We do not experience the reality just with our eyes. So one example, this naked cube, you can see this cube from two different kind of point of views, okay, in terms of which direction it is oriented to. These are the two kind of orientations, and that's kind of a slight example, very modest example of experiencing the same kind of photons, if you like, or pixels in very two different ways. It's the same pixels, but you can define or you can choose mentally how you view it, and these are two very different images and experiences in your brain, and that's kind of a prior of your point of view. And you can mentally control that. But that's perhaps a too kind of simple example for the prior that affects how we perceive reality. So I found this image of kind of upside down plates, which is affected, the way we experience that is affected by the prior of how we perceive or how we expect, where we expect light to come from. So if I'm just rotating this image, then you suddenly see kind of a different image. The plates are no longer kind of upside down, just because we expect the light to come from above, because we have the sun and all that, because we are used to this particular world and this particular body, etc. And now if I rotate it again, perhaps after a few blinks, or perhaps looking away and then back to the image, you're kind of forced again to interpret the image based on your physical priors. Okay, so it's not about interpretation in terms of conscious kind of thinking about the image. It's bare bones, very low-level perception of reality. We see the reality differently based on our priors. But what about seeing reality differently because some of us have different priors than the others? So there is the very famous, now very famous example of the dress, which I see as white and gold. I'm sure many here don't see it differently, probably as black and blue. And this is a very powerful example of an individual prior. Each one of us has kind of evolved and developed in a different way, acquired different priors, again, about the illumination, from which direction it probably comes to illuminate this dress, which makes each one of us to see the world very differently. Very, very differently. And the reason why this is so, struck so many of us and became viral was because it's very hard for me and for each one of us to understand, how can it be that you don't see the dress exactly like me? Okay, how can it be that there is some kind of reality and we don't see the reality exactly in the same way? And it's even more kind of dramatic because we have the same kind of shared reality prior, but with extended reality, or with XR, virtual reality, we are going to acquire very different priors about the reality. So this is not going to be a very rare example, this example of the dress. And that's just on the visual modality, kind of an example of how we see reality differently, but it spans all domains. How can it be that you don't understand this topic? How can it be that you don't feel or think like me? How can it be that you have this political view? How can it be that we think differently? And it's all based on our priors that actually makes us not only interpret reality differently, but actually perceive and see the reality in a very different way, which is eventually what made Ronnie Abovitz, the CEO of Magic Leap Mixed Reality, claim that using their glasses, their mixed reality glasses, you will eventually experience the world as real and not only as kind of an imitation, a holographic imitation of the world, because eventually taking together all this, we can say that what we got used to as having a shared reality, developing in a shared reality, and eventually interpreting reality according to that, now this is disrupted. Reality is becoming, in XR, is becoming dynamic, unlimited. There are no limits to how reality will look like, and the laws of physics, etc. And it's going to be highly subjective, which is going to affect how we interpret reality afterwards. What about the body? What about how we perceive ourselves, our body, our identity? Do we also infer about this body in the same way that we infer about the world, so that I can see different bodies and kind of believe in that? So there are many studies. I don't want to focus on that too much because I want to get to the cognitive aspects, the deeper cognitive aspects afterwards. But many studies for 20 years or so show us how using virtual reality we can actually make the brain very easily believe that you are embodied in a very different form, body form, very different form of an avatar, even in the form of animals. And interestingly, what we know from a different body of study, of research, is that the form of a body and the proximity, for instance, of our body to the cognitive stimuli, in fact, affects deeply the way we cognitively process these stimuli. For instance, when we put our hands next to the cognitive stimuli, then our attention is much more focused on the details of the problem, and we find it harder to see the big picture, for instance, what led me to run this experiment in virtual reality, when you are embodied in a virtual avatar, and then I'm kind of stretching your hand towards different stimuli in the virtual reality and showing or testing your attention and your cognitive performance near these objects. But actually, that was not enough for me at this stage to just show that online cognition is changing because of my online experience of the virtual reality. I was more interested in the offline cognition, in what happens. Can it be that eventually our cognition is changing after, when I'm, as I said before, when I'm already without the VR glasses, can it be that my cognition is deeply affected by the experience I just had because I was kind of exposed to this kind of new prior about the reality and my body and their interactions? So that was the motivation behind my research back at the Technion. I call this re-embodied cognition. From an evolutionary point of view, we may think about this. There is the paradigm of embodied cognition. We know that cognition has evolved kind of for action in order to support our survival in the world. And there is the coevolution of the brain, our body, the world, all governed by the laws of nature. All these has evolved together in order to support our survival in the world. All these cognitive mechanisms, and specifically mental imagery, this mental simulation of the world is kind of relying on this particular body and particular world. But in fact, in virtual reality or XR in general, all the basic assumptions of embodied cognition research are reshuffled, because now we have a different body, any arbitrary body form, any arbitrary world, and the laws of nature are also lines of code. So anything can be in this world. And I was asking back then, what will then be our embodied cognition? How will our cognition then simulate kind of the outer world, and how will it affect our cognitive mechanisms? So I chose this kind of, for my task, for the task of my experiment, I chose this mental rotation classic example. You have to decide if the two shapes are the same or a mirror image of each other. Okay, so these two are the same. These two are mirror images. Okay, try to solve this. These two are, again, mirror, and these two are the same. Okay, and as you probably experience subjectively, in fact, you are kind of mentally rotating these shapes in your mind. You're doing this kind of simulation. But interestingly, each one of us has a different speed, something that we kind of got used to in the physical world, a speed of kind of how physical objects are actually rotating in the world. So I wanted to tackle that. So I built a virtual reality setup where you experiment, where you do mental rotation before and after the experiment, and physical rotation practice in between in virtual reality. So you're kind of operating these handles with your virtual hands. Just a minute. Let's see if the video is working. Okay. Yeah. Oh, back. Just a minute. We'll get to that. Okay. Okay, so at the beginning, you have a mental rotation task. You just have to decide if the two shapes are the same or not in your mind. Okay? And in the physical blocks, afterwards, we're measuring the time it takes you to start rotating your hand, which is the time of the motor planning mechanisms in the brain, which we know that are overlapping with the mental imagery mechanisms, especially when we are babies. When we are babies, the same mechanisms for motor planning are using the same mental simulation as we use in mental imagery, which is one of the reasons why cognitive development when we're babies is so tightly coupled with motor control and sensory motor development. So that was the experiment, and I had two groups in the experiment. In one, the virtual hands actually were one-to-one mapping of the physical hands. In the other, there was some kind of distortion of the speed of the virtual hands, and they're mapping to the physical hands, so they were twice as fast, which made kind of the subjects kind of not understand what they're doing, kind of re-examining and learn their body and the world around them, and eventually they kind of got used to that. And we measured the motor planning time and the mental imagery time, the mental rotation time. And there were many findings to this experiment. The main result was that this new world of virtual reality, when we made the subjects kind of find a new body that they're now using that behaves completely differently, increased the mental motor correlation dramatically, meaning that this is the correlation, this almost 0.8, 0.9 correlation was between the mental imagery, the mental rotation, and the motor planning durations. And for those who kind of acquired a new body, a new embodiment, this correlation increased dramatically, which made me kind of interpret this finding as adults in virtual reality are kind of newborns that are refinding this new environment and kind of getting a second chance for relearning very basic fundamental sensory motor primitives, which are the basis for our cognitive development when we are babies. So, which takes us to, again, back to the take-home messages. As we said, XR disrupts our body and world perception, which are tightly coupled with our cognition, which makes me believe that this XR mind phenomena, if we call it that way, will disrupt eventually human cognition in a very fundamental way. And the implications, there are many implications, but three kind of main implications is that learning, future learning will involve XR practice, physical practice of sensory motor cognitive primitives. AI, which I don't have the time to talk about at all, but AI will make all these phenomena much more structured and goal-oriented, okay, and personalized, of course. And the combination in XR AI will eventually be a very fundamental HMP mechanism. Thank you very much.